and welcome to the Aronnax podcast and this mini-series which is focused on the growing influence of lifecycle assessments in industry.
The interest in lifecycle awareness is really growing, and it is a wonderful tool to assess both an organization but also a product. But it can be very challenging, but if it's done right, the improvement options are endless.
I'm Craig Eason, owner and editor of the Fathom World website, and I'm also podcast producer and host of the Aronnax podcast.
And I'm Rasmus Jensen, founder and CEO of Reflow here in Denmark, a company focused on helping companies, particularly maritime logistics businesses, to understand the true and total lifecycle picture of their businesses and products, and how to get a more granular understanding of their emissions for better decision making and new strategies.
Now, Rasmus, you're my guide through this series, and we've of course already heard from consumer makers, maritime equipment maker, about their growing desire to collect all that data to assess the life cycles of their products and their processes and even their total businesses. And I've also managed to talk to sustainable financial experts about new directives on reporting and the new taxonomy that's giving investors the tools to make decisions about their investments. And of course, in the previous episode, we spoke to the Chief Sustainability Officer at a chemical tanker operator and owner about their growing ambitions. But now, today, we're going to try and tackle something that the European Union and the IMO, the International Maritime Organization, are also trying to tackle. So in the next 15 minutes, Rasmus, we're going to try and tackle the issue of life cycles of marine fuels. It's a discussion at the IMO with regulators trying to come up with a way to decarbonize shipping. So just before we go into the first expert here, what's your thought about how difficult this challenge is going to be?
Well, especially when we talk about new fuels, Craig, we often have biomass sources, and creating a new fuel, designing a new fuel really entails a lot of decisions, and especially a lot of environmental concerns you need to put in there, because when you work with biofuels, you many times are taking a waste stock, a waste product, and then turning it into a fuel. But what is a waste today might be a valuable resource in the future. So working with life cycle assessment to assess biofuels and looking at new types of fuels is really a necessity, in my opinion, in order to make the right decision here.
We'll touch on the biofuels again shortly, as well as some of the other alternative fuels that are coming into the market. But first,
so my name is Roux. I originally come from South Africa, but I'm now a PhD researcher at the Technical University of Denmark, just outside of Copenhagen. And my PhD is on life cycle assessment modeling of maritime green fuels.
Now this, of course, means looking not only at existing fuels in their current delivery chain, but also the production logistics of future fuels, the power-to-X fuels, the biofuels, etc. I asked her about her research and what she's noted. And one of the things I wanted to ask her about also is I've seen a number of well-to-wake, there's this issue of well-to-wake fuels, a number of papers, white papers that have been published on that. But she's already noted something about the majority of these papers that she's examined.
It's very important for us to understand exactly what impacts these fuels might have, and from a more holistic perspective, not just from an operational perspective. And so what I've been doing is trying to understand, well, do we have the current framework and the methodology to fully understand the impacts associated with these fuels? And I've sort of found, well, no, we don't. And so we need to develop this methodological framework to assess the fuels before we invest heavily in them, so that we don't make some massive climate risk error. So that's why I think a life cycle assessment is important. And it's a pretty established methodology to assess the impacts associated with a product or a process. So I've currently focused my research on more academic and peer-reviewed journals, hoping that they might contain a bit more information than some of the reports we see from industry, which I think can tend to be a bit focused on or kind of directing a certain result. So I focused my research on peer-reviewed journal articles, and I've found already that there are quite a few gaps in these articles in terms of the methodology, in terms of what is stated. There is a kind of standardized way of doing a life cycle assessment so that it can be compared to other studies and reproduced. And I'm just finding that there's not much transparency in the studies that have been done.
What sort of aspects are missing from those studies?
Yes, so I won't go too into the kind of life cycle assessment methodology. I think it can get quite boring quite quickly. But there are a few things. So you need to know what basis you're assessing your fuel on. And it's also very important to establish what the aim of the life cycle assessment study is and what the scope is. So where are you kind of beginning your assessment and where are you ending your assessment? And this allows us to reproduce and compare the studies to one another. It's also very important to note what you include. So are you including the impacts of, say, infrastructure? Are you including the impacts of having to maybe your energy use? Where does your energy come from for the production of the fuel? And for example, are you looking at externalities, at other impacts, like the effect of changing the land if you're producing biofuels? And this can be indirect and direct. So there are many things that I'm just finding aren't really being considered in these studies. And then also like the impact categories that we look at. So a lot of the studies only look at global warming potential, but there are a host of other impacts that these fuels can have.
Do you mean effects that are not environmental, but maybe relating to corruption, child labour, other kind of social governance questions?
That too. I mean, I was just talking about environmental, but we haven't even opened the box of other impacts like social impacts and economic impacts that these studies aren't really considering.
The shipping industry is quite likely, some shipping companies, large shipping companies, have already started to make a move in particular fuel direction. They don't seem particularly worried about the life cycle assessment to that extent. If you're saying that there hasn't been a lot done, they don't seem to be too worried about the life cycle assessment. They're clearly picturing the emissions story and regulatory compliance at the forefront of their decision making. So why do we need to do a life cycle analysis if ship owners are going to make their decisions anyway?
Well, I'm just one person. I can't claim that I'm going to be able to influence all ship owners' decisions. And I think this is where policy and regulations are very important driving forces. But what I'm hoping to do is to sort of develop the methodology for the assessment of the fuels so that we can have a better understanding and a better tool to assess them, so that when we make these policies and we make these regulations, we really have a better understanding of potential implications and potential impacts. And that's kind of my role. And as a researcher, I have the luxury of, being able to focus on this, the luxury of time and being kind of uninfluenced by other things.
You say that there's a specific structure for a life cycle analysis, is there? I mean, is it sort of a given? So regardless of what you're looking at?
There is a standard. They're called ISO standards, and there's sort of 4 main elements that you're meant to declare, and kind of there's a method. But I just don't think that that's actually employed in a lot of studies, especially not academic studies.
That's Megan Roux, who has taken on the challenge of understanding life cycle assessments of marine fuels. So Rasmus, I know that this is a complex, and I dare say it's an issue that's going to be at the heart of this alternative fuels debate, because it comes down to how the IMO or any regulator could create future regulations for shipping and how this life cycle assessment of fuels is going to impact it.
Yeah, that's true. I think, Craig, what is really important here when we talk about assessing new type of fuels, if it's well-to-wake or LCA methodology, is that we are able to compare apples and apples. And if we use different methodologies, different way of accounting for emissions, or we are only looking at the climate change and not other areas that might be impacted when you produce a new type of fuel, then we might turn into something not as good as it could be. And I think it's excellent that we are assessing something, but it's also very important here that we have a harmonization in the way we assess the fuels. And it's all about making the right decision, because we are creating, so to speak, new supply chains. We are creating perhaps new factories that are producing this fuel, and being able to assess the impact of what's happening on land, for example, is really, really important here.
One of the issues that I've found when I've been looking at some of the ways that new fuels are going to be made is the variety of ways it can be done. Whether you're using carbon capture, whether you're using recirculation of CO2, effectively captured CO2 being used in the production of fuels, or whether you're using a fuel that doesn't have any CO2 in it, and even the biofuels. Do you think that the ISO standard, and we're going to touch on this again in a second, but do you think the ISO standard is a solid way to help make that apples to apples kind of comparison here?
I believe that the ISO standard, Craig, is a good framework to harmonize certain things, but I also think that when we start doing these assessments of fuels, there is a need for a more detailed framework where we can assess some of the more important areas, or we at least have a framework that makes sure that we don't remove these areas in our assessment. Because the ISO standard is a great starting point when making LCAs, but it also leaves a lot of room for different how you normally would call it cutoffs, but a lot of decisions that you can make in your life cycle assessment where you say this is not relevant, this is not important to my assessment, that might as well be relevant, right? But that is not harmonized, or that is not necessarily required in the ISO. So it could be beneficial in the future that we all agree, and I think that might be some of the work that is being done in the Maersk McKinney Centre for maritime decarbonization. So it's really exciting work.
Yeah, the Maersk McKinney Moller Centre for zero carbon shipping in the heart of wonderful Copenhagen. It was established to kind of set up and meet the challenge from a sort of industry perspective. It's largely funded by the McKinney Moller family funds and other external other businesses that have joined it to try and get this movement going a lot further. And obviously, it's done a lot of work already on looking at LCAs.
My name is Anne O'Connor. I'm the Lifecycle Assessment Manager here at the Centre. I sit in the Energy and Fuels team. However, my role also interfaces a lot with our colleagues in the onboard vessel solutions and very heavily with our regulatory affairs team.
Now, Rasmus, you and I met Anne recently at the Global Maritime Technology Conference in Copenhagen. And I'd say I was impressed with that work that they're doing on fuel LCAs. Now, here's something that I certainly hadn't put a lot of thought into, but it's this for the sake of this discussion, is important. And it goes back to this difference between life cycle analysis of a fuel and the well-to-wake analysis. Here's Anne's take on the difference.
Basically, an LCA analysis is extremely comprehensive. It looks at a wide range of environmental impacts. It looks at the energy required by the system to produce the fuel, to transport the fuel to the user to actually combust and use the fuel on board the vessel. And so it looks at the energy required by that system plus the material use. And it looks at the climate impacts of those two main inputs. And then it expresses the output as a whole range of different environmental impacts. So it's very comprehensive, it's very detailed, and it is based on an ISO standard. If we look at a well-to-wake approach, this is really an approach that has been adopted from, the transport industry where we had well-to-wheel. It is unstandardized in the sense that it doesn't have an ISO standard that follows it. It only looks at the energy required to produce and distribute and use the fuel, and then the associated climate intensity of that energy use. So to give you an example, if you are producing a fuel using green energy, then of course the climate intensity of that energy use will be relatively low in comparison to using grid electricity, for example, in a country that doesn't have a very decarbonised grid. And so really it primarily focuses on the climate impacts. And now we can also start to see how land use change is starting to form part of the climate change impact category. So that is starting to be included now as well. But that's the main difference in the scopes between the two. LCA, very comprehensive, looks at a wide range of different environmental impacts. well to wake, maybe less comprehensive, more suited to a global context, looks at energy required to produce the fuel, transport it and use it, and then the associated climate impact of that energy use across the system.
This was a little bit about the complexity and the difference between well-to-wake and LCA, and I think in this, I think that Anne is spot on. There is definitely a difference, and I think it's important that either you use well-to-wake or use the life cycle assessment methodologies. It's very difficult to combine them because one is including things that the other one is not. But I also think that, especially when we're talking biofuels and new types of fuels, it's important we don't only, or that we not only look at the well-to-wake aspect of it, because we might end up not including what we call in LCA terminology midpoint values. So Anne was just touching base on the land use. So if we're using a bio-based crop, we might end up creating, it could be a waste material when we start today, but if we, the maritime industry is really in need of a lot of fuel. So we might up creating a new type of main crop suddenly that are taking a lot of land. And that land could have been used for food or for other things that we are in need of in today's society. So I really think it's important that you don't only look at the well-to-wake. It's a good indicator, in my opinion, but the life cycle assessment, of course, it is more complex, as Anne also mentioned, but it gives us more data to make decisions based on. And I think that is a really important that we keep that in mind. And then also the LCA has the ISO standardization. And as I mentioned earlier, I think it's really a good start to have it international standard on it. But I also think we might in the future have the need for more detailed ISO standard for maritime fuels. But let's see. This might be some of the work that the Maersk McKinney Centre will be focusing on, because I can, from our aspect, really see the need that we have it even more harmonized in the future.
One of the points you made there about LCAs for maritime fuels. A lot of the fuels that we're looking at, these alternative fuels, whether it's ammonia, hydrogen, or methanol, they have other uses. They have other potential uses. So if a similar hydrogen atom is made using a green solution, so basically using renewable energy to create renewable green hydrogen, if you look at that then subsequent use in a land-based solution or in a marine solution as a marine fuel, would you end up with different LCA kind of comparisons there?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Craig. And the short answer, yes, because on the LCA, you're looking at the life cycle of the product, not just to produce it, but also to transport it to the end use, and perhaps also the use process itself. And I think that the maritime industry is, I still have yet to see some really commercially used hydrogen motors or engines in that size that we need for the big ships. But I can assume that there will be some difference in the marine-based engines versus the land-based, because there might be some restrictions on the marine-based. But just to make the answer a little bit shorter here is that yes, there will be difference in the life cycle assessments, and it can also be that on land you have some different options to prepare the hydrogen and so on, because you have a much more steady supply chain. Well, on the ship you have these tanks where you store it in, so there might be some differences in the energy consumption and in the environmental profile from the two solutions, and that calls for a different or separate life cycle assessments.
It's an interesting point, but I don't think the IMO or the maritime regulators are going to start taking that kind of breadth in their analysis, are they? They're not going to be looking at the well-to-wake or the life cycle assessment of a marine fuel and make that sort of comparison with that same energy molecule being used elsewhere in industry.
I think, Craig, it's important that we need to look at why should they do that. I think what is really important here is that we help the IMO to really make sure that they make the right decisions when it comes to new fuels. And it's my belief that LCA methodology is the way we're looking at the entire life cycle of a potentially new fuel before we make the decision. Whether we should make that a green fuel or not is very important. And I think we can compare it, and I wouldn't say it's a big catastrophe, but it is still something we didn't catch. If we look at the windmills, the previous generation of windmills, and then some of the windmills that are being used today, well, they were produced without having LCAs in place. And what we could see when the windmill is starting to age is that the windmill wings could not be reused anywhere, could not be recycled. So that ended up creating the need for landfill where these wings are being stored. So this is a small example on how it can go bad. And using the LCA, we would also know before we lock in a certain type of fuel and call it green, if the energy consumption and environmental impact that this fuel is creating is acceptable or not. And I definitely think we need to do that. The question is just what methodology and how should we do it? But I think it makes so much sense that we look at the entire calculation when we design a new fuel, because that is really what we're doing here. We have been for many years been using these fossil fuels, and that's from nature, take it or leave it. But what we are doing really now is we're actually designing our own fuel. So why don't we do it the right way and make sure we design something that's truly green, instead of just saying, just as long as we have something that is not leaving emissions out on sea, it doesn't really matter for us at IMO. Then it's the land legislation bodies that will have to deal with it, what happens on land. That's not really, in my opinion, the best way.
Well, I asked Anne about how long she thinks it's going to take for LCAs to begin to have an influence on the regulatory aspects of marine fuels.
Yeah, I mean, there's some predictions around when it will start to have an effect. 2025, for example, is a time in the calendar where people are expecting that ship owners will have to start reporting the climate impact of their fuel use on their fleet around that time. That, of course, is heavily reliant on how quickly these things will get through the IMO. And really, if you look at that, what we really need to accelerate that is increased engagement, really, from all the folks involved in the IMO. It's time for all of us to start contributing to the conversation and conducting analysis in our own organisations and feeding that into the IMO ecosystem, so that we can get to a 2025 whereby, you know, ship owners already have a good understanding of well-to-wake analysis, how it can support their decisions for the different fuels that they select for their fleet, and hopefully set them well on their way, so that when 2025 rolls around, it's not going to be a big surprise. And, you know, we have a whole industry kind of, you know, putting their hands in the air, kind of not knowing how to implement this, right?
Well, that was Anne O'Connor from the Maersk McKinney Moller Centre for Zero Carbon Shipping. Now, that's it for this episode. In the next episode, Rasmus and I will take a peek at an even more complex aspect of LCAs in shipping. And that's the kind of cradle to grave of a ship, from ship design and shipbuilding, with LCAs brought into that perspective.
Yeah, so within DAM, it's really in the early stage. So what we want to do, we're not fully do it yet. So we want to have a look at where are the materials, where are they coming from. Then you have for example, steel. Then it's made into, from the raw material, it's made into steel plates. And then we're going to make a ship out of it. Then the ship is being built and it's going to the ship owner. And then you have the end of life. And at the moment, we don't have the clear picture of the whole life cycle yet. So we sell a vessel, and then the ownership and responsibility is going towards the owner of the vessel. And what we want to do is to keep that ownership and that responsibility for the whole vessel, and also the end of life of the vessel. And also to make sure that in the design we think about the whole life cycle. So for the coming 30 years, what kind of developments are there? Indeed, if you shift from diesel engines to more alternative fuels, how can you include these future-proof principles in the design of the vessel? And we also need to know what is in the vessel at the end of life. So how can you decommission the vessel in a green way, and what do you need to know to be able to do that?
That is a really exciting next episode. I'm also really looking forward to the next episode, because one of the big thing is if you start putting in green fuel on a vessel that has zero emissions, then suddenly the fuel is not the biggest impact of the entire life cycle of the vessel as it used to be. Now it's the vessel itself. So that really proves that the future of green shipping needs to take the ship design, the shipbuilding into perspective. And this is where LCA really can make a difference. So really excited.
Well, I'm Craig Eason, host of the Aronnax podcast and editor and owner of the Fathom World website.
And I'm Rasmus Elsberg-Jensen, the founder and CEO of Reflow.
And remember to check out Reflow Maritime's website and to look for the Aronnax podcast on Spotify and most podcast hosting platforms, as well as on the Fathom World website, where I really do encourage you to sign up for updates and to get our regular newsletter. Until the next time, goodbye.